B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Friday, December 20th, 2019. This is our last podcast until the new year. We'll resume daily podcasts on Thursday, January 2nd. And let me take this opportunity to wish you and yours all the best for the holidays. Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Kwanzaa greetings. And if you're just a solstice fan, well, enjoy it as you wish. So last night, the Democrats, 7 of them, running for president, debated on a stage at Loyola Marymount University outside Los Angeles. And the debate was moderated by PBS and Politico. And yesterday I predicted that it wouldn't be that great and that the questions would be kind of lame. And while I don't think the questions were particularly different or novel, the tone of the debate was different. They allowed the candidates to speak. They allowed them to go back and forth at points and actually debate. And I also thought that by not front-loading it with the discussion about my health care plan versus your health care plan, which has dominated the earlier debates, I thought we saw a lot of good presentations by the candidates. I don't think anybody screwed up real big, including moderate Joe Biden. The gaffe watch was on him, and he didn't deliver any particular gaffes last night. And for my money, the progressives, Warren and Sanders, advanced the issues I care about very effectively with enthusiasm. I think Bernie yells a little too much, but and he was kind of red in the face. Not sure if he just got too much sun on the beach in California. Well, we haven't had much sun lately, so we'll have to scratch that theory. At any rate, the real standout to me, the surprise, came from Andrew Yang, who hit a home run with the very first question, where he explained why Trump won. And he said it wasn't Russia, and it wasn't any of the other blame games that Democrats have mustered. It was about job losses. It was about automation. It was about the communities that have been ignored since we started offshoring jobs under the Bill Clinton administration in the 1990s. And so I thought that Yang, on several occasions, came up with surprising comments. He sold his $1,000 a month freedom, what does he call it, a freedom grant or something like that, pretty effectively. And so I think that he really positioned himself well to be considered as a vice presidential running mate for one of the top candidates. I don't see him penetrating to the top tier. Also, Amy Klobuchar, who I don't support, she's just too moderate and brags about it and thinks that that is the key to victory. I thought she had a good night. She explained climate change well. She honed in on the need for campaign finance reform, the centerpiece of the corruption in our system. And I don't think that she messed up. Her interactions with Pete Buttigieg, and then we also saw Elizabeth Warren hitting back on Mayor Pete, I thought were very effective but civil. You know, it didn't degenerate into name calling or anything of that sort. So it's hard to find a candidate who I felt didn't do that well. I guess I'd have to pick Tom Steyer as the weakest performance. He did not connect with me, even though he's the champion of impeachment, the guy who dropped $50 million on TV ads promoting impeachment, and climate change has been his signature issue. And Steyer is effective when he talks about declaring a state of emergency on his first day in office, that it is his number one priority. But he just doesn't come across as somebody who has the skills and experience to navigate the swamp in Washington, D.C. And others may disagree about that, but I thought that while he didn't stumble and he presents himself very well, I just don't feel that there's a strong base for a billionaire. And Steyer positioned himself as the smarter, nicer, kinder, gentler billionaire compared to Mike Bloomberg, who, of course, wasn't on the stage last night. So there were a couple of points where Bernie Sanders really showed his stuff. At one point, there's all this talk about the climate crisis, California fires, dealing with the carbon emissions. And Bernie kind of cut through it all and said, look, your question misses the mark, because the question was about, would you support federal support for relocation of those who need to move to higher ground because of climate change? Well, once again, Yang said, I've got a plan for that. It's called higher ground. But when Bernie cut through, he said, look, the question is too narrow. We've got to save the planet, not just deal with some of the, more localized issues here in the United States. So the other time when he cut through was during a discussion about who can beat Trump. And Amy Klobuchar said, you need a Midwesterner on the top of the ticket. And then in a pointed exclusion of Mayor Pete, she said, somebody who has won statewide 3 times, which does fit her. And she made a point of exposing that Pete Buttigieg ran for state treasurer in Indiana and failed miserably. And he also ran to chair the DNC, which is where he kind of surfaced for this presidential race, and didn't even come close. So the other place where Bernie cut through is on this electability issue. And he said, look, the Democrats need to turn out a large number of voters. And the way you do that is with enthusiasm. You generate excitement. And all these other people were talking about, profiling themselves against Trump and who they see as their supporters. So I thought Bernie was very effective. As I say, he yells a little too much, and I know it makes some people uncomfortable when he's waving his arms all over the place. But to me, those are trivial compared to the message that he delivers. Bernie also scored well on a foreign policy question related to the illegal Israeli settlements that Mike Pompeo and the Trump administration have said they will no longer contest. And he was very strong, describing himself as Jewish, a guy who lived in Israel for a period of time. And he said we must be both pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian. Now, I understand the politics of that, and he called out Bibi Netanyahu as a crook and a racist. He talked about the travesty in Gaza, and I thought that he delivered that very well and set himself up not to antagonize the Zionist part of the Democratic Party, but to appeal to more progressive people who know that the Trump-Netanyahu axis is a death sentence for the Palestinians and any effort at a two-state solution. So the most pointed exchanges, as I mentioned earlier, were between Pete Buttigieg and first Elizabeth Warren and then Amy Klobuchar, and attacking Mr. Buttigieg for his fundraiser in a wine cave here in California last week. Elizabeth Warren contrasted that she's done over 100,000 pictures with people, whether they're technically selfies or not. And he said people who can put down $5,000 to have a picture taken don't have the same priorities as people who are struggling with student loan debt or struggling to pay off medical debt. And she dinged Buttigieg for these fundraisers that attract the big donors, and said that, nobody's going to be able to buy an ambassadorship from her. Buttigieg pushed back, saying, your campaign right now, Warren, as we speak, is funded in part by money that you transferred, that would have been from her Senate account, having raised it at the exact same big-ticket fundraisers that you now denounce. And he had a line about purity tests that you yourself cannot pass. But I think that Buttigieg was on the defensive. At one point, he was saying, rich people aren't evil, and I'll take money from rich people. And he is trying to appeal beyond the working class base of the wing of the party that Sanders and Warren are appealing to, and even hinted that he would take money from Republicans. So, I think that he feels that he also used the phrase about unilateral disarmament, that Democrats can't afford to do that when Trump has a personal fortune that he never spends and access to a lot of money from his very wealthy supporters. Now, one of the things that I have to criticize every candidate for, I pointed out yesterday in the podcast that the district court ruling, the appeals court ruling from New Orleans, that sent back to the lower court for further clarification issues related to Obamacare and whether the invalidation of the individual mandate invalidates the entire law. This is a threat, a fatal threat to Obamacare. And yet nobody altered their stump speeches to mention that this is a very real threat that the Republicans will be able to kill Obamacare. And that's why the call for Medicare for all, in my view, has so much resonance at this stage. So somebody should have been more on the ball about that. Now, the New York Times did a follow-up article on the debate focused on electability and identified each of the candidates in that respect. And this is where Bernie came through, as I mentioned. He said, let's talk about how we win an election, which is something everybody here wants to do in terms of defeating the most dangerous president in American history. So let me tell you how you win it. You have the largest voter turnout in the history of America, and you don't have the largest voter turnout unless you create energy and excitement. On Elizabeth Warren, her claims of electability, if you can't stand up and take the steps that are relatively easy, this is where she's hitting Buttigieg over his fundraising, you can't stand up to the wealthy and well-connected when it's relatively easy. When you are a candidate, then how can the American people believe you will stand up to the wealthy and well-connected when you are president? And here's his line. This is our only chance to defeat Trump. We shouldn't do it with one hand tied behind our back. I've heard that line before. Klobuchar, as I mentioned, is touting her strength in the Midwest as if that is the, deciding factor. Could be. But Minnesota, I don't believe, is going to flip to Trump. And so her arguments fall a little flat in that respect. One of the people who wasn't on stage last night, billionaire Mike Bloomberg, is likely not to be invited to future debates because one of the criteria is you have to have over 200,000 individual contributors, and he said he will fully self-fund, take zero contributions from others, and unless the rules are changed, and it appears that the head of the DNC, Perez, could do that unilaterally. At this point, we don't expect to see Bloomy on the debate stage in January. But he did unveil in Memphis his health care proposals. He wants to build on the Affordable Care Act. He didn't talk about the court case that threatens it. He wants to create a so-called public option that would be run by the government where individuals could purchase health insurance subsidies like the ACA, Obamacare, offers. And his plan would be free for low-income Americans in the 14 states that don't participate in the Medicaid expansion under Obamacare. So, these are proposals, and I don't get too worked up about that. But fundamentally, nobody has talked to actuaries. Nobody's run the numbers to say, can you have a Medicare buy-in or access option without balancing the different groups of healthy and sick people who create the risk to that insurance pool. So much of this is devoid from the underlying calculations that we can only take it as marketing. Now, that next debate is scheduled in Des Moines for January 14th, and the rules appear to make sure that Cory Booker and Mike Bloomberg won't be invited. The current standard is to make the stage, you must score 5% in 4 party-sanctioned national polls or 7% in 2 polls in early states. Now, one of the wrinkles is, I just learned today, there hasn't been a fresh poll in Iowa since the last debate in November. So anybody who has moved up, and Buttigieg is one of them, but I don't know about people like Booker in Iowa, they didn't even have a chance because there were not approved recent polls between the last debate and the one last night. The fundraising, the new standard for January, you have to have 225,000 individual donors. That's an increase from 200,000 in December. So we know pretty much for sure that Biden, Warren, Sanders, Klobuchar, and Buttigieg will be on the stage in January. So we'll see if Perez sticks by his standards or amends them. It is the end of the year, and Congress always does this. They put off critical must-pass bills that fund the government and prevent a shutdown. And in it goes some of the ugliest shit that you ever see turned into law or funded under congressional appropriations and authorization. So yesterday, before they jetted out of town, they approved in the House a $1.4 trillion federal spending bill. We know that's going to run up at least $1 trillion deficit. The Senate cleared 2 spending packages that comprise the dozen must-pass bills needed to prevent funding from running out tomorrow. And Trump is expected to sign this so he doesn't have a Christmas government shutdown like we did last year over the funding for his silly border wall. And so, you know, they load these things up. There's $25 million for gun violence research. That's a bit of a break. There were also provisions to fortify pensions and health care benefits for coal miners, repeal of 3 unpopular health care taxes linked to Obamacare, and raise the age to purchase tobacco products to 21 nationwide. But here's a real stinker. We've talked about Richie Neal, the Massachusetts congressman who chairs the House Ways and Means Committee, and he's got deep pockets that are lined by corporate interests on a regular basis. And I'm trying to remember, we did an interview with, I can't think of his name, but he lives in Richie Neal's district, and he writes about gerrymandering, and he was on the podcast early this year talking about just how much corporate cash Richie Neal gets. Well, in the bill that passed yesterday, one element was deleted. It was an effort to correct an ugly loophole that leaves people who go to the hospital with surprise medical bills, and it relates to using a doctor who's out of your network and similar issues. But Richie Neal pulled a last-minute fast move that basically fractured the coalition that was supporting this particular fix. And it fell apart because Richie Neal, he gets a lot of money. In fact, there are hedge funds that benefit because they've bought up physician staffing firms, and they're the ones who are getting extra profits by charging patients exorbitant amounts for uninsured coverage. And it turns out private equity groups spent $30 million on a dark money ad campaign to fight this proposed legislation. So last week, Richie Neal upset the apple cart. He released a counter proposal that wasn't even fleshed out, and as a result, nothing happened. And you are still exposed to extreme hospital bills that you might not be expecting when you can least afford it. Every day I pause for a minute here on the podcast to thank the people who support my work with your subscriptions. People like Andrew Rush, he's been on board for a long time. Stuart Russell. Robert Matheson just took out a new annual subscription. Thank you. And Suzanne Bowen is a monthly subscriber here. I also want to mention Paul Elsesser, who has been a very generous supporter of this podcast and frequently gives me good feedback. And I appreciate each and every one of you. I invite you to spread my podcast around, invite friends and family to become subscribers and support my work as we head into this critical election year in 2020. Just send them over to peterbcollins.com. You click on menu, then click on Become a Subscriber, and it's easy to pick the level of support that's comfortable for you and your budget. So the first crack in Trump's evangelical base has surfaced, as a prominent evangelical magazine, which was founded by the Reverend Billy Graham. It's called Christianity Today. They wrote a blistering editorial saying the president attempted to use his political power to coerce a foreign leader to harass and discredit one of the president's political opponents. That is not only a violation of the Constitution, more importantly, it is profoundly immoral. So this was written by the retiring editor. His name is Mark Ghali. And he said to his Christian readers, remember who and whom you serve. Remember who you are and whom you serve. If we don't reverse course now, will anyone take anything we say about justice and righteousness with any serious for decades to come? Nearly 99% of Republican white evangelical Protestants in a poll said that they all oppose Trump's impeachment. So their evangelical Christianity doesn't appear to have much impact on their political thinking. And so here came Trump fighting back in a tweet. And I want you to note the binary false choice that he lapses into. This is his favorite argument, which is you attack him, he attacks you back, and creates a choice between him and a bizarre worst-case scenario. All right? So here's what he said about Christianity Today. Quote, a far-left magazine, or very progressive, as some would call it, which has been doing poorly and hasn't been involved with the Billy Graham family for many years, Christianity Today knows nothing about reading a perfect transcript of a routine phone call and would rather have a capital R, capital F, radical left non-believer who wants to take your religion and your guns than Donald Trump as your president. Now, this editorial didn't mention guns, didn't mention anything else. Didn't mention taking your religion. I don't know how you would do that. He went on to say, no president has done more for the evangelical community, and it's not even close. You'll not get anything from those Dems on stage. I won't be reading E.T. again. Now, it would be C.T., not E.T. E.T. is Entertainment Tonight. What an idiot. So Pelosi left for the holiday break without sending the articles of impeachment over to the Senate. It leads to speculation. Will the Democrats ever do that? I think they will. But I think they're enjoying this moment where it leads the Republicans to make all these crazy claims. And Earl Blumenauer, a Democratic congressman, said, what do you think's going to happen if these sit there for a month or two? Trump will go crazy. That 6-page letter, I mean, he's coming unhinged. He can't contain himself. So we'll see if that transpires. But there are two Harvard law professors who are quibbling over whether by holding on to the articles of impeachment, the impeachment actually and technically occurred. So on one side, Professor Noah Feldman says, impeachment as contemplated by the Constitution does not consist merely of a vote by the House, but of the process of sending the articles to the Senate for trial. Both parts are necessary to make an impeachment under the Constitution. If the articles are not transmitted, Trump could legitimately say he wasn't truly impeached at all. But the retort comes from Professor Lawrence Tribe. In a tweet, he said Feldman is making a clever but wholly mistaken point. He cites a chapter and verse of the law and says that Trump was impeached on December 18th, 2019. He will forever remain impeached, period. Today at The Nation, Aaron Mate has a good analysis of the Democratic leadership's strategy on this impeachment, which he says is doomed and dangerous. Now, I don't agree with everything that Aaron Mate says here, but he does make some good points that this Ukraine-gate impeachment was linked to Russia-gate, which is a discredited conspiracy theory. He says the rhetoric used by Adam Schiff and Nancy Pelosi, saying that Ukraine's fight is our fight, is not only transparently disingenuous but also dangerous. By the Democrats' own logic, Obama is guilty of far worse because he refused to provide any military funding to Ukraine at all. Now, Mate says that he agreed with Obama on that, but the inconsistency of the Democrats here is noteworthy. He also says that the real foreign interference in the U.S. election was Christopher Steele's dossier, paid for by the Clinton campaign and the DNC to obtain dirt on Trump related to Russia. This, I'm quoting here, this act of foreign interference was so consequential that it led to the unwarranted surveillance of a U.S. citizen, Trump campaign volunteer Carter Page, and played a major role in fueling 3 years of baseless, all-consuming speculation that Trump is compromised by the Kremlin. And when Ukrainians leaked documents that led to the resignation of Paul Manafort, Democrats had no qualms about benefiting from that kind of foreign meddling. Now, here's where I don't agree with Mr. Maté. He says he cites that President Zelensky of Ukraine has repeatedly denied a quid pro quo attempt from Washington. And I think that that is it is a pose on Zelensky's part. He knows that he needs to find a way to get along with Trump, and he doesn't want to be in the middle of this battle between the Democrats and Trump. So on that, I don't agree with Maté's point. He also says the second article obstruction of Congress faces a hurdle. Even if the Democrats do have a credible case, they face the same quandary as after the Mueller probe. A legalistic obstruction dispute will not win broad public support unless it is established that Trump is guilty of the underlying offense. I strongly disagree with this. I don't believe you have to prove the crime to prove the obstruction. And his withholding of evidence and witnesses from the impeachment inquiry, that is very clear evidence of obstruction, irrespective of any other crimes, including the ones that they left out, like Michael Cohen. And so Maté supports Tulsi Gabbard's call for censure, and I believe that that's just a traffic ticket that doesn't have much meaning. But I've linked to Aaron Maté's article, and I encourage you to read it and come to your own personal conclusions. Meanwhile, the Durham investigation, that's John Durham, the hand-picked U.S. attorney who Bill Barr has selected to investigate the investigation. Well, Durham is now reportedly focusing on John Brennan, the former CIA director. And as you know, I suspect Brennan was at the center of the Russiagate narrative from the start, and that his assessments provided, false information that promoted the media firestorm and the political division over the whole Russiagate scandal. And I welcome this investigation. I just don't have confidence that it will ultimately be fair. I think we need to see exposure of what John Brennan's role actually was. But this is a political witch hunt by the Republicans, to use their language, and so it does not infer any real credibility. John Kiriakou, former CIA whistleblower, he's got a great piece up at Consortium News today. He happened to be watching last weekend when Chris Wallace on Fox News interviewed James Comey, the former FBI director. It appears to have really pissed off John Kiriakou. Now, when asked about the Inspector General report, which found 17 significant errors and omissions by the FBI, Comey said that he had been overconfident when he defended the FBI's use of FISA. Overconfident! Exclamation point, writes Kiriakou. Comey ignored the fact that the FBI repeatedly renewed the warrant against Page, whom the FBI suspected was working for Russian intelligence, even if it had no evidence to indicate that was the case. He downplayed the fact that an FBI attorney illegally changed an FBI report to indicate that Page was not working for the CIA when the FBI knew for a fact that he was. And most disingenuously, Comey told Wallace, "I thought the FBI had gone about this in a thoughtful and appropriate way. Horowitz is right. I was wrong. I was overconfident as director in our procedures. It's incredibly hard to get a FISA." Well, that sends Kiriakou's blood pressure way into the red zone. He says, over its lifespan, 33 years, the FISA court has issued almost 35,000 warrants, 34,000. It has denied only 12. And he says, the truth of the matter is that the FISA court isn't really a court at all. It meets in secret. A defendant has no idea the government is asking for a warrant against him, and no attorney to represent his interest. All that happens is that the FBI, usually with CIA or NSA information, goes before a FISA judge and says, "Give us a warrant," and they walk out with it. Very well-written piece. also linked up in the show file for today's podcast. The new Conservative majority in the House of Commons in Britain has given the wish that Boris Johnson asked for. With a plurality of 124, they passed his Brexit deal this afternoon, and this will lead to an official exit as of January 31st. I want to recommend a great piece of reporting by Alan McLeod over at DemPrez News today, and I commend him and Caitlin Johnstone for continuing to press for the truth about the chemical weapons investigation that was manipulated related to the alleged use of chemical weapons in Douma, Syria last year. And this has led to a controversy where a reporter named Tariq Haddad has resigned from Newsweek in protest that they wouldn't publish his factual articles that showed the disarray in the reports of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. And Newsweek was not alone in failing to report. Virtually the entire mainstream press, except for Tucker Carlson, and I hate to acknowledge him at all, ignored or downplayed the findings in the Syrian civil war issue. There's more to the article, but I'm running over here, so I want to encourage you to follow the link and read that. Also, in my journalism file today, a report from the Columbia Journalism Review exposing a murky organization that has posted 450 websites in a network of local and business news organizations, using names like the East Michigan News, the Hickory Sun, the Grand Canyon Times. These are websites that, at least so far, have published mostly bland information that was taken from public records. They have very few human reporters there, but they do intersperse the bland reporting with stories like that cite Republican talking points related to the impeachment as a witch hunt, the abuse of power, and other obvious bias. And CJR does a good job of showing that they have 12 state networks, they're 5 corporate entities, and you may think this is leading up to some Russia claim. Nope, this is all American. This kind of media disruption, fake news, if you will, is owned entirely by American investors. In Washington State, an investigation has declared that Representative to the lower house Matthew Shea participated in an act of domestic terrorism against the United States. And Shea is a far-right figure who holds extremist Christian, nationalist, and Islamophobic beliefs. He participated in many of the Bundy occupations, including the one that we covered in 2016 at the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in southern Oregon that led to the FBI shooting of Lavoy Finicum that we covered in some detail at the time. Turns out that Shea was present at most of the Bundy-related occupations of the last few years, and there appear to be some pretty damaging emails that were unearthed in this investigation. Kudos to Contra Costa County, just across the bay from me here in Northern California, because their conviction integrity unit has overturned 3 cases, criminal convictions linked to a bad cop in the community of Antioch. And the cases are not as important to me as the process here, where a progressive district attorney is investigating the work of her own office going back years and making sure that prosecutor misconduct and wrongful convictions are corrected. Boeing has more egg on its face. Its Starliner, which is a capsule that was launched from Cape Canaveral this morning, went into orbit, but the wrong orbit. Could be a software error, just like that MACS software that caused 2 737 MAX aircraft to crash, killing well over 300 people. And finally today, the first satellite designed to continuously monitor the planet for methane leaks has made some important discoveries. A little-known gas well accident at an Ohio fracking site was leaking massive amounts of methane that was undetected. So a Dutch-American team of scientists published this week in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences indicate that, here's a quote, "We've entered a new era with a single observation, a single overpass. We're able to see plumes of methane coming from large emission sources." So they identified a site run by ExxonMobil in Belmont County, Ohio, that has released more methane than the entire oil and gas industries of many nations in an entire year. It triggered about 100 residents needing to move. But this is an important tool because methane leaks like the one we had at Porter Ranch in Southern California really remove the benefit of every Prius on the road, every solar panel that is installed, and every valiant effort we make to reduce our carbon footprint. Thanks for listening to my last daily news and comment podcast of 2019. You're free to share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube. Merry Christmas from Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.